freaks. It's Hank Balch. You're listening to Unbroken, the care and handling of endoscopes, sponsored by Richard Wolf. And we're going to be talking to a roundtable panel today on the topic of disinfection and sterilization of endoscopes. We'll dig into some nuance. We'll tell a few stories and answer a few questions maybe that you've had even from your customers or your clinicians out there, your users that are using these devices, about, hey, why do we do it one way? Why does the hospital down the street do it a different way? Why can't we do it our way, the way that we've always done it? And we'll talk about all those topics and more in this upcoming interview. So hang with us and we'll be right back with our studio guests. All right, we're back in studio episode 5 of this Unbroken series. And today's episode, we're talking about microbes beware, disinfection and sterilization of endoscopes. And this is a hot topic in our industry, has been for a number of years now, and it doesn't seem to be cooling down anytime soon. There's some strong opinions, not even on both sides, because I don't think it's like an A or B. It's a gray area, and there's different perspectives on processes and technology and effectiveness and quality tracking and design. Everything is just kind of woven in. And so we're going to be touching on a lot of that today in the next 20-25 minutes. But before we get too far, I do want to introduce or reintroduce the guests that we have on the show today. If you're tuning in, if you've been with us already since episode 1 and specifically episode 2, you're going to recognize these names and faces and these voices. But we'll do a quick round of intros just in case this is your first introduction. And now we're going to convince you in one episode to go back, start all the way back at episode 1 and follow this journey to catch up. So let's start here first with Bobbie Gaskins. What's your story, Bobbie?
Hi, everyone. I am Bobbie Gaskins. I am the operations manager over sterile processing for the Cleveland Clinic's ambulatory surgery centers. I'm all over Cleveland, from the west side to the east side, all the way down to Worcester, with 5 locations total. Also am president of our Northeastern Ohio Central Service Association. Super thankful to be able to educate and connect with the local sterile processing chapters here. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, good to have you back, Bobbie. Let's go next to Garett Kaple.
Sure. Thanks again for having me here, Hank. I'm, again, Garett Kaple, marketing manager for reprocessing at Richard Wolf. I handle all of the product management, creative marketing strategy for the reprocessing products at Richard Wolf. And then I also help customers out if they have questions about things like sterilization or do in-service as well. So I'm excited for today's topic because it comes up a lot for me. So
that's right. Yeah. So you give me an amen when I say it's a hot topic these days.
Daily.
All right. Well, welcome back to the show, Garett. And let's go here next to Nicholas Day. What's your story, Nick?
Hi, Hank. Thanks for having me as well. Nicholas Day. I am a regional manager at University Hospitals Cleveland, reside on the west side at a couple of medical centers. I'm responsible for sterile processing, high-level disinfection, and equipment management. I volunteer with Bobbie on our local HSPA chapter called Northeast Ohio Central Service Association as the VP. So look forward to the discussion.
So on our last episode, y'all, we talked a lot about the inspection stage of these devices when you talk about endoscopes and just the critical role that it plays in keeping these babies operational and keeping them safe for our patients. But we actually didn't get to a topic that makes a little sense to talk about in today's episode. And it's beyond visual inspection, that stage that starts getting us into this cleaning and disinfection stage. Is it ready yet to go on to the next stage? That's what we'll be answering. And the tool that we use in those scenarios, actually, I guess there's various tools, but it's getting at what kind of residuals, if any, are still on this device. So, Bobbie, can you speak to just what's available out there today that teams are starting to use or have been using maybe even now for a while in saying, hey, is everything that we did in the manual cleaning stage, was as effective on this scope?
Yes. Protein testing has really changed the game, not only for endoscopy, but for all surgical devices. One way we've implemented this into our facilities and our ASCs is we started small with doing one endoscope a day. We have short, small staffed facilities to where we didn't want to roll it out, guns blazing, let's do every scope every time. So we started with one a day and then worked our way up to 2, 3, 4. So now we're doing 80% of our scopes, residual protein testing before they go into the Medivator. So it's given us a peace of mind and also given our nursing and physician staff a peace of mind because it's documented. We've been able to implement that into our tracing as well and tracking, and it's easy, user friendly, and gives you that peace of mind.
So, Nicholas, as Bobbie alluded to, these kinds of rollouts are difficult at times, especially if your staffing is already tight and you're saying, we're going to add one more thing to the process. So, there is that temptation from the staffing side or even the clinician side who's maybe waiting longer now for these devices. How do you confront that pushback? And then the balance of what Bobbie said, getting this peace of mind. So that's kind of my first part to the question. And then the second part of the question is, what happens when these tests fail? Because Bobbie kind of told the story, hey, we're getting peace of mind, we've got the process, it's good. But obviously, these tests are not going to pass every time, especially at the very beginning. So when they fail, what is that telling you about your process, and how, as a clinician, should you be responding to failed tests if you're doing these residue tests?
Sure. Yeah. First part, I think, having that culture, that strong culture of high quality work, safety, education, not a punitive environment where, if, there is a positive test for some reason on the, when it's coming through and being checked with a channel check for a flexible scope or swabbing a surface of a rigid or semi-rigid or anything, that the tech that cleaned it is, the manager leader's not going to run back there and give them a corrective action, so providing that type of, environment and advocating with your team and getting their buy-in on why we're doing it. And really then at the end of the day, it's for patient safety and to reduce, microbial contamination and, HAIs, surgical site infections, whatever it be. I can give an example of what we did as a system. We implemented this off of the AAMI standards under the quality portion. And I believe it's in one of the annexes of AAMI on how to kind of set up a program. So we created a system policy at my organization for CSP and rolled that out to all the sites on how many kind of channel checks we're going to do, the frequency. We do it on every single scope. And then we also do, residual tests, so protein, carbs, and hemoglobin on random tests through our washers and hand washed items. Once that became a policy, we were able to put in more standard protocols on how are we going to assign this fairly to our technicians to do. Is there, in that standardized process. So we have, standardized amount we're doing. We have a standardized assignment. So it's assigned to a different person each day. That person does it with the flexible scopes. It's done on every single scope. So whoever is going to get that scope and assemble it would do the channel check right away on that scope and, kind of go from there. If we have a positive documented, obviously it goes straight back to decontam to go through the entire process, full recleaning, and then we residual test it again until it is a passing result. And that continually gets documented.
Garett, we hadn't used the phrase IFU yet, and so we're going to get it in. It was funny, before we started this episode, we were like, hey, IFU is going to be the first thing that comes out of our mouth in this episode. And we were strong. We held off until 8 minutes in now. But I want to bring it up now because, this test is one of those, even like Nick said, there's outlines and structures in some of our guidelines for quality testing in general, what that program could look like. But this is one of those things that in many cases, beyond the device and even out there in the industry, there's not a lot of clarity or hard, firm expectations for what all this testing looks like. And so we're trying to, in some sense, go beyond the IFU. When you're speaking to customers out there looking at, building these kind of quality programs, especially when it comes to testing scopes like this, how do you speak to them around, hey, this is what our IFU says, what's required by FDA, but this is also what we know is probably a good idea to take a look at to give that level of peace of mind, that Bobbie was describing at the beginning?
Sure. So the main thing that I would say is obviously follow the IFU like you were getting into. But some of the things I see, for instance, in our IFUs, it'll, I guess, tell you how a component should come apart. Some things are made to be sterilized, put together. Some are made to be taken apart. So make sure we're following those steps. And then also I've seen some facilities that just have trays that are there's way too much in it, and stuff that might not necessarily go in the same tray, or it goes with something else and they're just trying to fit it. So I think just sticking to following the way things should be sterilized, and then also paying attention to how much you're putting into a tray should help alleviate some of that stress.
So maybe to ask my previous question a different way, you, in dealing with clinicians that are testing these residual tests on the scopes, you're not saying, hey, our IFU doesn't say to do that, therefore don't do it?
No, I see what you're saying. No, definitely follow any practices that your facility has in place. We're never going to tell a facility not to do something. So yeah, if doing the residual test is standard practice, by all means, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's what I thought, but I just wanted that question.
No, we're never going to tell somebody not to do something. We just say stick to the IFU, and then if they have questions that are a little bit hard to interpret in the IFU, that's where we come in and help out.
So have you experienced or gotten any feedback from any customers or an industry regarding doing any of these quality inspections on, scopes that you have or worked with, and any damage or any kind of, adjacent issues related to, doing these type of additional best practice inspections?
Like as far as like visual inspections or using the borescope, or
any of it. I think we're speaking of kind of like the channel checks or resi tests or any of that stuff.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, the channel checks, like as far as using like a borescope, I know we get a lot of questions. Facilities sometimes think they see damage and it's actually the way that the scope is put together. So I guess to answer your question, yeah, it would just be mainly that.
The segue here to my question on, hey, is it okay to go beyond the IFU and do a residual testing, actually connects to the topic of this episode, which is, hey, if the IFU just requires disinfection, high-level disinfection, for instance, can we sterilize this anyway? And it does go back, to validation questions, obviously, for the devices. But I want to kind of talk maybe to you first, Bobbie. As you sit down and you look at your scope inventory from that clinical perspective, knowing the IFUs, you got IFUs in front of you on one side. You've got these industry best practices that Garett kind of alluded to and said, hey, if it's an industry guideline and best practice, we support that. So we want that to happen in the clinical setting. How do you balance that? Or, what information are you using to decide, are we just going to high level disinfect, or are we actually going to sterilize this inventory?
Yeah, and it's a situation that we've been in our ambulatory surgery centers. First of all, the IFU, of course, whatever that mandates you go with. But if you have the option between manual or sterilization or HLD, you have to get a team together to make that decision. And we were doing manual Cydex of cystoscopes and ENT scopes in one of our family health centers when I first came in. And immediately I started looking for opportunities to start moving that to sterilization, because for us in our ASCs, it's just easier for us to have them sterile and in sterile storage. But we had to evaluate a few things. And first and foremost, that was inventory. Sterilization can take longer instead of HLD. HLD is quick and easy, and you got cleanoscope bins or whatever you're using back and forth. And it's not that full sterilization process. So we had to talk to them about upping their inventory first and foremost, or having disposable scopes to back them up while we're doing that sterilization process. We also had to look at logistics. Our family health centers are attached to the building, but our SPDs are, on another floor. And you're going from the reprocessing being done in the family health center suite right next to the physician. It's quick, in their hands immediately, to now it's all the way back in SPD and out of sight, which they don't always like. Sometimes they like it going on right next to them because they feel like they're more in control of their product and their scope. So the physician is definitely a part of that conversation as well. So partnering with the clinical team, looking at logistics, best practices, the IFU, putting all of that together with an interdisciplinary team to decide what is our best route for really patient safety at the end of the day. So all of that together, you should be able to make a decision, but you got to bring all members to the table.
I think that's a good breakdown. You talked about the equipment piece, you talked about the inventory level piece, you talked about the control piece or the trust piece. Maybe you got the logistics in there, then obviously the IFUs of the device, because, some of those decisions are going to be driven directly by the IFU, whether or not it's validated, to make one decision or the other. So, Nick, as you look at these decisions between high-level disinfection and sterilization of some of these devices, they're not created equal. It's not like the exact same risks are inherent to both or the same hazards either to the scope or to the technician that's reprocessing. So can you talk us through maybe some of the common risks and hazards, both from that device perspective, but then also from the technicians that are reprocessing these things?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to hit the hot button right away and make a statement. Just because a device is validated for a certain process or method does not always make it the best process for the device. So with that being said, I've seen manufacturers validate low temperature sterilization, for instance, over steam. And then the manufacturer has come out with letters stating that low temperature, it can only withstand 60 cycles of low temperature because the epoxies or the components of the device will break down and deteriorate over time. So it's real important to do your own research on your device. And there's numerous amounts of white papers out there, people that have done so many reprocessing cycles and different modalities for different devices, and speaking and engaging with our industry to learn the best practices and what the best reprocessing method is for these certain devices, I think is really important without getting into the weeds of both processes, really just going back to the IFU and then doing your own internal validations, which you should be doing anyways, to make sure that your device is, meeting sterility aspects and then adhering to the best practices. So
that's an important insight, though, that you bring up is these devices don't live forever. I think the phrase I used on the last interview was it's a hard knock life for these little guys. And the decisions that we're making, to your point on how this end process is going, if it's high level disinfection, if it's sterilization, even this particular modality that you brought up could impact its useful life. And that's by design, right, Garett? Like, you can't make a device that's just going to last forever. It gets impacted by these things. So when you're talking to customers, that are purchasing these devices, how do you help them work through these dynamics and these kinds of decisions that we're talking about today?
Yeah, so it's always a bit of a challenge, especially with cleaning chemistries. I know a lot of times facilities will want to switch to a cheaper one or one that they think might be more efficient. There's a lot of reasons. So where we come in is we try to help them make that decision, choosing a cleaning chemistry, and talk them through, hey, if you're switching, make sure you're sending the scope in to get properly cleaned before you switch cleaning chemistries. Because sometimes when you combine cleaning chemistries, it can have a reaction on the scope, and a lot of facilities don't know that. So that kind of stuff is where we come into play to help them make those decisions. And then when it comes to sterilization, obviously, we like to joke about our flexibles that, yeah, you could put it in the autoclave, but just once because it's going to melt. So, but then when it comes to low temp, obviously, we just say follow the IFU for instructions regarding that. And obviously using the appropriate tray or how you're wrapping it comes into play as well.
If I can add one feedback to that too. Yeah. So I didn't answer, Hank, your second part of your question, the risks. So really, there's distinct risks between, doing high level disinfection and sterilization. Obviously, the exposure of the high level disinfection to our technicians, and then versus, low temp, you still have some hydrogen peroxide exposure potential, but it's a little lower, much lower risk than, a splash of HLD to your face potential, depending on if you're doing automated or manual processing. And then versus steam is you're just messing with the heat. And then if the device can withstand it. But to the bonus or the positive aspects from HLD to sterilization, you aren't really risking an explosion with a flexible scope per se. like you may in sterilization versus HLD, you're not dealing with that pressurization of the device. So it's, risk and reward for either process, in my opinion.
I forget if it was Garett or if it was you, Nick, who brought up the containerization, but then also I'm going to take it into the storage aspect, and I'm going to throw this question to you, Bobbie. Depending on the decision that you make, obviously, if you're disinfecting, if you're low temp, if you're sterilizing through steam sterilization, taking these devices then from that stage into the storage stage, if it's like a scope hanging room, for the larger scopes we may have, if it's a cart, maybe for respiratory therapy with our bronchoscopes or ENT scopes, let's go back to family clinic, right? Their storage dynamics look even more different than that. Or if they're being terminally sterilized into some kind of wrapped container or even rigid container, that impacts the associated risks then during storage and during transport. So can you speak to the dynamics or, maybe some lessons learned around that, even as you have changed some of the practices, it sounds like, in some of your clinics?
Yeah, of course. So we have endoscopy that's being done right in our SPD OR spaces. And then we have that endoscopy that's being done all the way in the family health center. And they each have different storage and modalities, things of that nature. And when you're in a closed space, my best experience has been in a system that isn't a large red bin, that is segregated away, that's by itself when it's coming to you to keep it from damage. Then when you're sterilizing it, having that container system to place the scope in will prevent damage. I've seen facilities that are just wrapping scopes by themselves and there's no container. You want to make sure that you have a nice solid container that's going to keep that scope safe, stable, and segregated away. And then if it's wrapped, you're going to wrap it and sterilize it. Same if it's a container system. My ASCs were space restricted, so we went with wrapping everything. So we do ensure that they are kept by themselves, though. In storage, we have a endo rack. So they're not, mingled in with ortho or general instruments. It's cysto, ENT, and, flex scopes by themselves, which we really have seen a decrease in damage by doing that segregation, as before they were coming to us intermingled with instruments. And that's really where you see your main damage occur. Now, when you're in a family health center, for example, you may not be able to use like an open transport system, like a cleanoscope bin, for example, or something like that. You have to have that gasketed, closed, leak-proof, spill-proof container to transport throughout the facility. So that can create another bottleneck in your department if you have those large red bins that things are being transported in. And then when it comes to hanging the scopes, sometimes you don't have room for cabinets and they want to have that, quick right there in the place, it being reprocessed in the family health center, but then they don't have anywhere to store the scopes and they want to stage them in a bin to come to them. We've seen that where they're being staged in transport bins. And that's because they don't have room to hang the scopes in the facilities. So you got to make sure whether you're hanging them, you're storing them in sterile storage, that they are segregated, of course, and that will really reduce damage, reduce risk, and keep your scope safe.
I think that's a theme that, has come up a couple of times even on this series, is the gaps in practice, specifically either in the clinic setting or just outside of the direct OR setting with many of the smaller diameter flexible scopes. And even, I guess, for some of the rigid scopes, if we're talking about ENTs, et cetera, that lack of standardization, number one, makes it very difficult to support if it's being centralized into sterile processing. But then number two, Nick, just being aware of current practice and current guidelines and current research out there about what some of these risks are that are associated if you're getting manual cleaning wrong, or if you're getting disinfection, if there's gaps in disinfection, or even just documentation around the process. And then obviously for the sterilization piece, I know you've all probably seen scenarios that you go through all that, you sterilize scopes, and then kind of to Bobbie's point, that's not how they want them staged. And so they're opening sterilized scopes and then staging them in kind of a storage, like an open storage dynamic that's like, well, why did we go through this whole stage if you're just going to like store them like you would a high level disinfection scope. So maybe as we wrap here, Nick, I know that wasn't a question, but the question is, how do you approach this gap in practice, gap in awareness in a way that you're viewed as a resource to help them, not as someone's coming in to tell them that they're doing it wrong and that they can't do it the way that they've always done it anymore?
Like Bobbie practices, I also perform work for about, anywhere between 25, 30 offsite reprocessing locations, physician offices, rather, clinical setting where, I think the industry could probably agree anywhere I've worked, even not just speaking of my organization, but those are, I think a lot of times people try to get the work out of those and really back into the sterile processing department's hands, being the experts. So really partnering with them to learn if we identify a space that we need to take over processing for, we have a pretty standard, consistent practice, and we have strong communication with that leadership team of that location. We have documents that are standardized and set up step by step on the transport process, our process internally, the logistics, how we expect the device to be pre-cleaned, broken down, put in a bin in a proper manner and sent back to us, but then also how they want to see it coming to them. And then they are in the awareness of how, how it gets processed over here on our facility. So yeah, really just setting the standard and really taking initiative, because I can tell you more times than not going to be on the receiving end, they're not going to take the initiative to do that. The SPD leader that's providing that service generally, and more times than not getting a chargeback fee, should be providing that service and setting that up and really setting the standard and meeting the customer's expectations, and then ultimately the patient, and providing, the safe products for the patient.
And just to piggyback off of that, we've gotten a lot of pushback from trying to take reprocessing away from the family health centers. They're stuck in their ways and they like doing it and they have a process. We've had physicians say, oh no, SPD breaks the scopes. We don't want them going back there. So it's interesting that, we receive that pushback trying to take work from them, but we've had success in a lot of the family health centers, thankfully. But you do see that, which is frustrating at times.
Yeah, that's why, again, not to toot our own horn, but these kind of conversations to addressing that gap in awareness of maybe how far some of those practices are from current guidelines and best practices out in these ancillary areas, just to make them aware of, hey, yeah, maybe you're protecting the scope because you only got one scope or two scopes, but you're actually not cleaning and disinfecting this appropriately. You're not inspecting per guidelines. You're not following IFUs. And so you start surfacing some of that. The phrase you used, Bobbie, a couple of episodes was peeling back the onion to just see how far are we from this level of expertise to next point that your sterile processing team can support, even in communication direct to the manufacturer, like we talked about Garett. Do you have the latest training of visual aids out there for your technicians in some of these ancillary areas? And many times the answer is no, just because they don't have that connection that we do on the SPD side. So I think that's a great way to wrap up this episode. In if you're listening and you're processing your own things your own way in the ancillary context, ask some questions of your sterile processing counterparts in your health system. If you don't have any counterparts, then reach out to the folks that are on this interview. We're going to have their contact info listed in the write-up. And if you are processing for clinics, outlying clinics, doctors' offices, etc., ask questions on the front end before you kind of step into it, like Bobbie said, and make sure that they understand why you're doing, that you can build trust, and that you can meet that expectation of customer service that they have already, because it's one door over. If you're going to be shipping these things across the campus or even across town many times, so that they don't lose anything in customer service, but they gain in quality and compliance. And that's obviously what we're all in this for. So y'all, terrific conversation again today on this. This is one of the most debated topics in this space today. We're all trying to work through this thing together, but I think y'all did a good job laying out just some things to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you so
thanks,
much.
Nick.
All right, That's going to do it for episode 5 of Microbes Beware in this Unbroken series with Richard Wolf, talking about all things care and handling of endoscopes. Hopefully, you've got some insights and perspectives there around changing processes if you're deciding to start disinfection. Maybe you've been sterilizing scopes before and you're like, hey, we want to bring some flexibility to the process and maybe high-level disinfecting instead of or in addition to your sterilization workflow. Or if you're looking to go the other way, which is maybe more common, and you're saying, hey, we want to take this beyond high-level disinfection, we want to move into the sterilization stage, whatever it is, whatever that decision is, it comes with some complexity and some nuance and the need to build collaboration and trust with your end user. So I'm glad that we spent a fair amount of time talking about that today on this episode. As I said in the interview, we are not done with this series yet. We got one more, episode 6, coming at you next. So hang with us. Thank you for tuning in. And as we remind you each and every week here at Beyond Clean, keep fighting dirty.